Hey, this is Mr. Simmons. This is our last video lecture before you take the test on Friday. Today is Monday morning. I believe it's around 10 o'clock a.m. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over your review guides, the answers to your review guides. So there's part 3, part 4, part 5, part 6, and part 7. Okay? So this very straightforward video lecture. We're just going to go over the review guide and I can give you some final tips on the DBQ at the end. Okay? Awesome. Okay, so I don't have a cameraman today and we can't zoom in and zoom out. So the best way to do this is you should have your review guides in front of you. And the first review guide you should have is review guide number 3. Okay, this is titled Road to Revolution. So the exam, I believe, is units 3 through 7. And so that would exclude everything up to the revolution. But I think you should be prepared for causes of the revolution and the French-Indian War. So let's discuss that. So the first question said, in the decades before the American Revolution, the English colonial westward movement, the answer was B, disrupted the existing French-Indian fur trade. Just remember that Indians were dependent on trade for clothing and guns and other items, and that was one of the things that weakened them. This is kind of symbolized in Pontiac's rebellion. Remember Pontiac and the Indians of the Northwest Territory, or the Indians were reliant on trade with the French, and then when the British won the French-Indian War, they refused to trade with the Indians, and then the Indians became desperate and rebelled. Number 2, the Proclamation of 1763 question, the answer was B. Parliament's decision to punish the colonies for their refusal to pay taxes. Just keep in mind that Proclamation of 1763 antagonized colonists because one of the reasons they fought in the French-Indian War was to gain access to Western lands on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. So the war was fought by the colonists to open up the Northwest Territories. And after the war, when they drew that line, that made the colonists angry. So that's definitely a cause of the revolution. If you turn the page, number 3 was B. The Indians wanted to limit the movement of white settlers. Indians took the French side in the French-Indian War, and the Indians took the British side in the Revolution. So that tells you that they're really not loyal to any one European side. Their main goal is to limit white settlement, particularly of American colonists. There's a stimulus question, number 11. The answer was C. Widespread Protestant evangelical religious revivals. Notice the source is an Anglican preacher. So Anglicans were, establishment, Church of England preachers. So they're going to look down on backwoods people. And that's why the answer is for number 12, social tensions among backcountry inhabitants. This is the First Great Awakening. It helped bring literacy to backwards people and helped spread revolution ideas. Scroll down there with your eyes to the French-Indian War. The fill in the blanks was, the first one was the Proclamation of Neutrality, 1763. The second blank was Quebec Act, and the third was the Northwest Territories. Then you turn the page and you have a couple more blanks. That's Pontiac's Rebellion and the Paxton Boys. The Paxton Boys is a symbol of Scots-Irish immigration, had sort of intensified and became pretty pronounced by this time. And they were also angry that they could not encroach on Indian land west of the Proclamation line. So they slaughtered a bunch of women and children. You want to be sure that backcountry tensions is a theme that you have in your head, and there's a bunch of rebellions that sort of support that. You have Bacon's Rebellion, the Regulatory Movement, Whiskey Rebellion, and Shays Rebellion. And each rebellion has a little description that you want to go back and look at. I don't think it's necessary that you understand all of the different taxes and events that led up to the revolution, but if you fill in the blanks and read over it, it's not going to hurt. So the first one was the Stamp Act. This is important because it's a direct tax. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty, the Quartering Act, and keep in mind the Quartering Act and the Stamp Act were both acts passed by the British Parliament to finance the French Indian War debt. The Townshend Acts was actually a series of, I believe, 4 acts. Sorry, my dogs are wrestling over here. One was they Louis, Mimi, no. One was they suspended the New York Assembly until they could comply with the Quartering Act. They imposed a direct tax on colonists for tea, glass, and paper. They enforced customs collection more vigorously. Because remember, salutary neglect, they pretty much ignored these things for a couple hundred years. The Navigation Acts, there was a series of them, there was like 4 of them. None of them were very effective. And then the other one was compensation to the East Indian Tea Company. Then you had the Boston Massacre. The two blanks are Samuel Adams and Paul Revere. And then the Boston Tea Party was the last blank. Number 7 was the Intolerable Act. This closed the port of Boston, required that representatives of the Massachusetts government be replaced and be British politicians, allowed the British to be tried in England, and it upgraded the Quartering Act. Number 8 was the Continental Congress. 9 was Lexington and Concord. 10 was the Olive Branch Petition. Number 12 was Thomas Paine. 13 was Thomas Jefferson. And then Locke. Keep in mind, if they ask you any kind of revolution question with any kind of focus on the Constitution, you definitely want to remember that the Enlightenment and Locke influenced Jefferson and the signers. Okay, so those were the causes of the revolution. Once the revolution was won, and you don't have to focus on any of the battles of the revolution. I don't have it here, but I think if there were 2, it would be the Battle of Saratoga, which was the turning point, and then the Battle of the final battle. I'm blanking right now. Where was it? It was in Virginia near George Washington's home. Not Lexington, not Concord. Sorry. So focus on number 4. You have the new nation. One of the key things that you definitely want to remember is the Marshall Court. John Marshall was the Chief Justice. He was an ardent Federalist, and they passed a bunch of court cases which strengthened the federal government and weakened the power of the states. Marbury versus Madison established judicial review. McCulloch versus Maryland was a states' rights case, saying the states could not tax the federal bank and made the federal government supreme over states. And then Gibbons versus Ogden ensured that the federal government could regulate commerce. If you turn the page, Alexander Hamilton was the driver behind the Bank of the United States, excise taxes, the first tariff, reducing states' debts, and basically creating our entire financial system. We hammered home over and over the differences between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalists represented big capital. They were on the East Coast, banks, large landholders, merchants. The Anti-Federalists were farmers, everyday commoners, workers. They eventually morphed into the Jacksonian Democrats, but at that time they were the Democrat Republicans. There's a stimulus question. Number 1 is C, number 2 is B, and number 3 is C. There's a picture on the next page that represents Republican motherhood. Keep in mind that the revolution greatly enhanced the status of women because women were seen as important teachers of revolutionary virtues. Under the key idea, you have George Washington, who warned against political parties and foreign entanglements in his farewell address. The underlying part is XYZ, impressing sailors. I think for the Adams administration, really the only thing you should focus on is the Alien and Sedition Act and the suppression of civil liberties. This is another theme. You saw Lincoln suspend habeas corpus. President Wilson and Congress passed the Espionage Act and Sedition Amendment. That's as far as you got. You didn't need to learn anything past that. Nullification theory started with the Virginia and Kentucky Resolution in objection to the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Revolution of 1800 is sort of a boring subject that gets passed by, but it's actually critical because it's a peaceful transfer of power. The Federalists had controlled the country and established the country for 2 administrations, and we just peacefully voted Jefferson in. Jay's Treaty, Britain agreed to evacuate forts in the Northwest Territory. Debts were sent to arbitration, which was like the first time that had ever happened. And this is really the beginning of Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists establishing the first party, which was in defiance of the Federalists. It did avert war with Britain and led to 10 years of peaceful trade with Britain during the French Revolution. Pinckney's Treaty, the Spanish were worried that we were making friends with the British, so they opened up the lower Mississippi to trade, including New Orleans, and then they established the Florida boundary at the 31st parallel, which exists today. For the main ideas here, number 1, how justified were the Americans in initiating a revolution against Great Britain after nearly 150 years? So you had the Proclamation of Neutrality, angered them. Direct taxes to pay for the war was in conflict with salutary neglect. The French-Indian War created resentment. The conduct of the British in the French-Indian War made colonists angry. The Enlightenment made the British look hypocritical, and the Intolerable Acts, probably of all the acts, were the most egregious. What were some challenges the Americans faced? So you had British occupying forts in the Northwest Territories. They lacked a strong constitution. The Articles of Confederation were weak. There was no sound financial situation. Hamilton's plan had not yet been devised. There was no legal or solid institutions, and Indian attacks continued, and there continued to be backcountry rebellions. Compare and contrast the Hamilton-Jeffersonian movements. I'm going to skip that because you just did a DBQ on that. Last page, the answer was D. Okay, so that's 3 and 4. I've got 3 more. Let's do number 5. Jefferson to War of 1812. The first blank is the Hartford Convention, which is a second example of nullification theory. The Embargo Act, which was a total disaster for Jefferson and ruined his second term. The Federalist opposition of War of 1812 was the nail in their coffin, and they later became the Whig Party. The next blanks are Midnight Judges and Judicial Review. Territorial expansion. The Treaty of Greenville basically ceded almost all of Ohio and much of the Northwest Territory to Americans. Tecumseh was the Indian, his brother was the prophet, if you remember. We studied this a long time. Tecumseh was the guy who led the rebellion and fought with the British and died at the Battle of Thames. Jefferson purchased Louisiana Territory from Napoleon. Jefferson was reluctant to sign it as he was an anti-federalist. And then Lewis and Clark discovered the land route to the Pacific Ocean. There was never a water route. Warhawks was the South and West, led by Calhoun and Henry Clay. They wanted to start the War of 1812. The Federalists / Whigs were against it, which is another reason that the Federalist Party died. Canada was a complete failure. Washington, D.C. and the White House were burned by British. Oliver Hazard Perry won a great victory on Lake Erie, which is where I'm from. And Andrew Jackson emerged as a hero for the British defeat at New Orleans. War showed the emergence of sectionalism, and New England and Middle states opposed the war while the West and South supported it. Jackson defeated the Creek Nation in the Southwest, the United States, in Alabama and Mississippi, which opened up Indian removal and led to eventually the Trail of Tears. Aftermath of the War of 1812 left the country with a new sense of nationalism. You have the Battle of New Orleans, declining reliance on Britain, the death of the Federalist Party, a lot of unity under one party, and territorial expansion led to optimism. The lines, connecting the lines, American system went to, come on, Amy, help me out here. Sorry. The American system went to, proposed by Henry Clay, Tariff of 1816 enacted to protect U.S. industry, Patent of 1819 over speculation, Bank of the United States formed as a response, westward expansion, land exhaustion, Missouri Compromise, slavery allowed, sectionalism as national unity. The Monroe Doctrine, Europeans stay out of Western Hemisphere, Rush-Bagot Treaty, limited naval fleets on the Great Lakes, and the Convention of 1818 led to American fishing rights and set the northern boundary from half of what today would be Minnesota to Maine. I think it said the Lake of the Woods. Adams-Onis Treaty ceded Florida to the United States and set the borderline along the Louisiana Purchase. Gibbons versus Ogden, McCulloch versus Maryland. I don't know what the third blank is. I think it's just a repeat. I think it's still McCulloch versus Maryland. Market revolution. I'm going to read you the blanks. I know it's boring, but it'll help you. Society was hierarchical with plantocracy, wealthy merchants at top, and mountain people at the bottom. Aristocracy meant you had over 100 slaves and at least 1,000 acres. 75% of poor whites and hillbillies didn't have slaves but supported the peculiar institution. That's obviously the South. Good transportation, high economic growth, high population fueled by immigration. By the 1830s, factories had expanded beyond early textile factories, and later on, steam power allowed them to move south. African Americans were pushed out by cheap immigrant labor, along with naturalized poor whites. Cotton gin led to extension. That's the South. Going down here, Battle of Fallen Timbers and Black Hawk Wars. Canals and early railroads linked Midwest farmland to East, leading to expanded commercial farming and cash crops, new inventions, steel plow, mechanical reaper, and then there's a list of new cities that formed on rivers and lakes like Detroit and Chicago, Cleveland, and Buffalo. 4 million Irish came. They basically settled in the cities and became involved in the Democratic Party. And developed machine politics. Martin Van Buren, Jackson's successor, was the kingpin of that. Later on, you have Tammany Hall, many Irish involved in Tammany Hall. Lots of corruption. Know Nothing Party with the nativist movement. And then the South was very defensive about slavery. They came up with all kinds of fake excuses. Some were religious, some were economic. The worst one probably was the fact that slaves were better off as slaves than being free, and they were being treated as children, things like that. The South adopted codes of chivalry and limited careers to farming, law, ministry, and the military. Calhoun was the big slavery apologist. All right, so the answers, moving a little faster here. Number 1 is C, 2 is C, 3 is A, 4 is D. The Erie Canal connected commercial farming in the Old Northwest and Northeast New York City, so the answer is E. For Jackson, you want to focus on the Tariff of Abominations, which was a protective tariff, 50%, I think, designed to aid Northeastern manufacturing. It was hated by the farmers in the West and in the South. In fact, the nullification crisis out of South Carolina was a consequence of that. The bank war, Jackson opposed the rechartering of the bank. And he basically denounced the bank as a private monopoly run by wealthy people. And then his solution was this thing called pet banks, if you recall. This all led to the Panic of 1837, which Van Buren inherited. The Specie Circular also led to the panic because Jackson said that if you wanted to purchase federal lands which had been seized by Indians illegally, you had to pay with hard money. I'm going to let you go through the big ideas on your own, and that will be number 5. Number 6. We'll go through the answers pretty quickly for some of these. Number 1 is C, 2 is B, 3 is B, 4 is A, 5 is C, 6 is B, 7 is D, 8 is C. For number 7, keep in mind Manifest Destiny, Western Development, Environmental Transformation. You want to remember that mining, ranching, homesteading, okay, devastated the environment. It along with shrinking of the Indian reservations, led to the decimation of the Indian cultures. They were given all this land. It was then shrunk into smaller and smaller reservations. They had trouble surviving because their hunting grounds were taken away, and the buffalo were almost exterminated. Number 8 is C. There's a lot of diversity in Western Manifest Destiny. Don't forget, hey, push like that. If you get a Western question, focus on that too. You have Chinese building the railroads, Irish. You have Chinese out there in the gold rush. You have African American sailors jumping off ship to work in the gold rush. So there's a lot of diversity out west. Turning to page, number 9 was B, 10 is B, 11 is B, and 12 is C. 13 is B. This is a Southern argument against slavery based on economic grounds. The audience of this argument were fellow Southerners. Not every Southerner was against, not every Southerner supported slavery. Most Southerners did not have slaves, A, and B, there were many Southerners who wanted to develop the South on, the Northern model. It's really the plantation elite owners, the plantocracy, that controlled the South. And they had the gag order, so you couldn't criticize anybody, or they would put you in jail. Number 17 is D, 18 is C, 19 is B, and 20 is C. 21 is A. William Lloyd Garrison was a New England guy from Massachusetts, I believe, and he was an apprentice working in a newspaper. He's an interesting guy. His dad deserted him when he was young. He was raised by his mother, and then his mother died when he was still young. He raised himself. He became a famous writer. He founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, and his publication, The Liberator, was an important abolition magazine or newspaper. He was opposed to, don't forget, you have the American Anti-Slavery Society and you have the American Colonization Society. Those are two different things. 22 is A, 23 is B. The blanks, number 1 is Second Great Awakening, abolition, common school movement, women's rights, and temperance. For Texas, it's Stephen Austin, Catholicism, slaves, Alamo, Republic of Texas, Manifest Destiny, President Polk, Fight, Guadalupe Hidalgo, Texas, Utah, New Mexico, California, Nevada, etc. The concept of people voting whether they would have a slave state or not was popular sovereignty. The blanks are gold, Oregon, environment, reservations, Civil War, Manifest Destiny, and Homestead Act. Causes of the Civil War. The Fugitive Slave Act was a major cause. The South could catch escaped slaves up north. If Northerners did not assist them, they could be fined or imprisoned. This was one of the most contentious aspects of the Compromise of 1850, if not the most. Compromise of 1850, California becomes a free state. Utah and New Mexico establish popular sovereignty. No slave trade in D.C. Kansas and Nebraska Act, we talked about this at length. Stephen Douglas used this as a way to bring the railroads to Chicago and enrich his benefactors. This invalidated the Missouri Compromise, along with the Dred Scott decision, because if you're going to say somebody is a slave north of the Missouri Compromise line, then that's invalidating the compromise. The election of 1860 was the straw that broke the camel's back. Lincoln's election led to South Carolina's secession. Okay. Sorry. Number 7, last one. This is the big one. Obviously, the last 2 or 3 pages you didn't need to do. Let's go through this. Number 1 is D. Number 2 is A. 3 is D. Remember that the war started to end or to preserve the Union, but it sort of morphed into ending slavery as well. And Lincoln was waiting for the battle, and it was the Battle of Antietam, to issue the proclamation. 6 is C. This is total war. Sherman's March to the Sea. 7 is A. 8 is C. You have the Homestead Act for number 1. I didn't know what B was. The Pacific Railway Act? Maybe, I don't know. That's not important. Your Civil War amendments, obviously you need to know the 13th, 14th, and 15th. Freed the slaves, citizenship, right to vote. Go and look at all my terms for Reconstruction. 10% plan, black codes, radical Republicans, midterm elections, Freedmen's Bureau, carpetbaggers, sharecroppers. All of that's important. If you get a Civil War Reconstruction question, you definitely need to go there. Number 1 is D. 2 is B. You had this long chart. I'm not going to go through all of that. I'm just going to assume that you filled that out and went through it. The Progressive Era, read the highlights. I'll go through the blanks though. Under the Progressive Era, this is Political Machines, Muckrakers, Florence Kelley, Jane Addams, Theodore Roosevelt, Robert Follett, Booker T. Washington, W.E. Du Bois, Knights of Labor, President Taft, Jacob Riis, President Wilson. Go through and look at the causes of imperialism. I could see you getting, this would be a good red meat, easy DBQ on imperialism. So make sure that you have all of these filled out. If you didn't fill them out when you turned in the homework, that's fine, I guess. I'll have a look at it, but because I haven't graded the last homework assignment, but these need to be filled out for your benefit. APUSH likes imperialism. Has all the ingredients that they like. Number 1 was B. And then here you have all the terms. Insular cases, Platt Amendment, Anti-Imperialistic League, Dollar Diplomacy, Spanish-American War, all that. You're going to have to go back and study if you don't know. What I recommend is you take your notes and your ANSCO book and make sure you fill out all of these really well. So then you're really prepared for the online test. World War I, number 1 is B, number 2 is D, number 3 is A, number 4 is A, and a lot of the stuff we had just studied before we left the classroom. World War I and what was it? What was our last 1920s? So all that should be fresh in your mind. Number 5 was B. 6 is D. World War I is also a red meat daylight question. Treaty of Versailles, League of Nations, 14th Point, Red Scare, Palmer Raids, Espionage and Sedition Acts, Clear and Present Danger Case, Great Migration, Mass Mobilization, and all that's good stuff. 1920s was our last subject. We just studied this. This is also a good subject to study. You've got the Scopes Monkey Trial, the Harlem Renaissance, causes of the Great Depression, sick industries, stock speculation, lost generation, all that's good stuff. I'll give you the answers for the quiz. It was, number 1 was C, 2 was D, 3 was E, 4 was A, 5 was C, 6 was D, 7 was B, and 8 was A. 9 was C, 10 was A, 11 has all the answers. These are causes of the Great Depression on the top. Go back and study those. I'm not going to tell you what the lines, where the alphabet soup lines go to, because we just studied that and you had a quiz on it, and you obviously know those. Going to under We Can Do It, the answers, 1 was D, 2 was A, 3 was A, 4 was C, 7 was D. There was no answer for the Zoot Suit riots for some reason, but you remember those were Navy seamen on leave who rioted in LA, beating up Mexican young men who wore these new fashions of suits. And then look at the role of propaganda and women and children and families in World War II. I would guess, this is some final tips, I would say the American Revolution is obviously a subject that could easily be asked because they're not asking anything before. Okay, so American Revolution is definitely a subject that could be on the DBQ. That includes also part of the new nation, Washington and Adams administration called the Federalist era. So you got leading up to the revolution, don't focus on the battle so much, and then the post-revolution new nation era. That in itself is a major, very possible question on the DBQ.